Hey everyone, Ashweez Cosplay here with a tutorial video. So I am going to teach you how to make piping as part of a series I hope to do where I upload tutorials once per quarter. And yes, it's the end of March. So coming in very last minute with Q1, but that's okay, it still counts. So this video we're going to go over how to make and install piping. So what is piping? Piping is something that you can add to your sewing project to give it a nice level of polish. It can be added to raw edges or seam allowances. It is bias tape, but with cording inside it. So that gives it a nice little dimension to it, keeps it from being flat. You can see examples of it in pillowcases, purses, backpacks, just about anything. Dresses, skirts, whatever. I used it specifically for my Seraphine dress in the bodice. I made piping for it that's in the same fabric so that it would match, and I think it adds a nice level of texture to it because it's got those little bumps on it. So instead of it being flat, it's got this nice texture to it. So we're going to teach you how to make it as well as how to install it, so how to sew it into your seams. So with that said, if you would like a written version of this tutorial, you would rather read instead of watch, I welcome you to check out my website, ashweezcosplay.com. You can check out the tutorial there and follow along, read at your own pace, and it's going to go over the same exact steps, so you won't be missing anything if you just pop out, leave the video, and go read it instead. So I welcome you to do that if you're so inclined. But if you're still here and you're still watching, thank you, and I hope you enjoy. Now, let's learn how to make piping. Before we begin, you're going to need some supplies. You'll need fabric, 1/8 inch wide cording, a ruler, fabric chalk or a similar marking tool, scissors or a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, pins or clips, and a sewing machine. And your sewing machine is going to need either a piping foot or a zipper foot. I use in this video an invisible zipper foot, but you should be able to use either. The first step to making piping is to actually make bias tape first. Bias tape is fabric cut in strips along the bias of the fabric, and the bias being the 45-degree angle of the fabric. This keeps it from fraying and also gives it a little bit of stretch. So to make bias tape, you're first going to have to find the bias of your fabric. Do this by laying your fabric flat and make a note of the direction of the grain. Make sure that it's going up and down and left to right. Then take one corner of the fabric and fold it over to form a triangle, making it so that the side edge now aligns with the top edge. Iron this fold down so that you get a nice crisp line going down the fabric. This line is going to be our bias. Next, use your ruler and the fabric chalk to mark this line. Alternatively, you could go ahead and cut this if you have a cutting mat and a rotary cutter. Next step is going to require a little bit of math. To figure this out, use this formula. The width will equal the seam allowance times 2 plus the cord width times 2. Our cording width is 1/8 inch wide, so times that by 2, you get a quarter. From there, calculate using your seam allowance. So for instance, if your seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch, your total is going to come out to 3/4 of an inch for the bias tape. Using your ruler, mark dots 3/4 of an inch away from the edge you just created by making the first cut. Do this in a few spots. Then, connect the dots using a ruler and cut along the lines with your scissors. Alternatively, if you have a rotary cutter, you can skip the part where you connect the dots using the chalk or marker and just use your ruler and rotary cutter. To finish the bias tape, cut the ends at a right angle. One optional step is to connect all the bias strips that you just cut out. If you would like a long strip of piping, you can do this step, but if you're okay with lots of shorter strips, then you can ignore this. First step is to pin or clip the ends of 2 bias strips together, right sides together, so that they form a point. Then, stitch them together using your sewing machine. Don't forget to check your thread tension before you start sewing. Stitch the 2 pieces together following a 45-degree angle. Once done, cut the excess fabric. Continue this for all the strips, making sure to follow the same direction each time. You should end up with one continuous piece of bias tape. The next step is to wrap the cording. Carefully pin the cording to the inside of your bias strips. I find using pins rather than clips is a lot easier because you can get as close to the cording as possible. Once pinned, use a piping or zipper foot to stitch along the line of pins, right up against the cording. For this, I used an invisible zipper foot. Make sure to not catch the cording as you stitch. For this, I used contrasting thread so that you can see the stitching. For yours, you can add matching thread so that you don't see it. And with that step done, you have now finished your piping. Congratulations! Next up, how to install it. For this example, we're going to do a straight stitch. Pin or clip the piping in place on the right side of the fabric. Line up the fabric edges together. For this, we'll be using this cute green and pink plaid fabric. Using a zipper or piping presser foot, stitch the piping in place, again making sure not to catch the cording. Once that is done, lay your second piece of fabric right side down onto the piping. You should now have a little sandwich where the fabric is the bread and the piping is the yummy deli meat or veggies or whatever. As a reminder, the piping should be touching the right sides of the fabric. This way, after you stitch it and turn it right side out, the piping will be sandwiched in between. Once you've finished clipping it in place, bring it over to your sewing machine again and stitch right next to the piping cording, again making sure not to catch it. This is one of those cases where you'll kind of need to feel it instead of see it. And that's how you do a straight stitch with piping. For corners, clip or pin it in place as normal along the straight edge. But when you meet the corner, carefully clip the bias tape, and only the bias tape. Make sure not to clip the cording. Just before the corner, about the width of the seam allowance. Now, you should be able to bend the piping to match the other edge of the fabric. Once clipped, use your sewing machine to stitch it on just like you did with the straight stitch, but this time, be mindful of the curve, so you may have to lift your presser foot to adjust the angle of the needle once you get to the corner. Curves are fundamentally the same as corners, but you may have to clip the bias tape a little more dependent on how long or deep the curve is. For this one, the curve wasn't too bad, so I just clipped it every couple inches. Here, you can actually see where I messed up when I was making the piping and accidentally stitched over the cording. This wouldn't be so bad if you had matching thread. That was the how to make and install piping tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned a little something. If there's something else that you'd like to learn from me, whether it's a sewing technique or a prop making technique that you've seen in one of my build videos, please let me know in the comments and I will do my best to break it down into a nice tutorial both on my website and this YouTube channel. So again, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!